I knew Richard Holbrooke when he was a 22-year-old, 23-year-old province rep and political officer in Vietnam when I was there in 65, 67. I knew him to be very knowledgeable about Vietnam. Not everybody has mentioned that he spoke Vietnamese. He'd had language training, and there weren't too many Americans who spoke Vietnamese. He'd been all over Vietnam, and he knew that war that year and in years to come as well as anybody in the country. As a young man, very smart guy who understood that war. And in fact, I'll say very briefly one little piece of news here. When he left the government, not the government, but when he left the Foreign Service and went to be head of the Peace Corps in Morocco, I was in Morocco just before the Pentagon Papers came out on a last-minute vacation with my wife. We've been married recently. And to get over there before the Pentagon Papers came out. And I knew that he was in Casablanca as head of the Peace Corps. Richard Holbrooke was the person that I made a special trip to. I hadn't been planning to go to Casablanca. I was elsewhere in the country. And I made that special trip to spend a day with him to try to persuade him to come out against the war in the way that I knew he believed. His views and mine on the war at the time I released the Pentagon Papers were indistinguishable. And his knowledge was such that I knew he could be a very powerful figure on that. If he were to come out and he said, "No, Dan, I've put that behind me. I've left Vietnam. That's my answer to the problem. You know, I'm trying to do something else here, seriously." And he did not, pardon me for saying it, but jeopardize his career by taking that step, and as really nobody else did either. He wasn't different from the others. But as I say, I knew him well then. So when he comes around representing us in terms of Afghanistan, I knew that he had to recognize Afghanistan as the same kind of war as before. The differences are obvious, but not significant. The analogies are fundamental, and the hopelessness of it, fundamental. And what's new, of course, here is what I spoke of earlier, that unlike Vietnam, where we were not threatened at home by what we were doing in Vietnam, now we're actually endangering Americans by what we're doing. That's a difference, and it doesn't favor Afghanistan. So when I heard him being quoted as Obama's representative and Hillary Clinton's representative, saying we would make progress and saying optimistic things, I didn't know. Well, I thought, as before, he's saying what he has to say, but he can't believe that. I cannot believe that he can have blinded himself so much to what he and I knew about Vietnam at the time. That's what I thought. So I was very interested, finally, in the book by Bob Woodward, which on virtually every other page quotes top secret classified documents that he has been shown, that have been leaked to him by people in the government. In other words, he is as vulnerable to prosecution as Julian Assange or the New York Times. There is no way to distinguish what Bradley Manning correct, Bradley Manning, no, that's different, that's like me, or the people who leaked him the documents. But in terms of putting them out, no way to distinguish him legally or in any other way from the Times or Assange. And I'm not saying that to say that Woodward should be prosecuted, quite the opposite. I think the book has much to tell us, this particular book. His earlier books, some of them I did not admire so much. But this one has a lot of good stuff in it. And it's an account of how we got to where we are today in the decision-making process last year, leading up to that escalation. It's from that book that I learned what I quoted to you earlier, that General Lute, General Jim Jones, General Eikenberry all opposed the escalation, said it was against our interests, against the view of Petraeus and McChrystal, who were in effect isolated in that view. Also Rahm Emanuel, very interestingly, opposed it, and Richard Holbrooke, privately. But he worked for Hillary Clinton, as it said, who favored the escalation. She was his boss, and so that totally limited, as in the way I've just described, what he could say publicly, or even to the president. Meaning, as I've just said, what it means for such people, he had to lie. Had to lie? Well, he did lie. His job, which I'm sure he felt was in the interest of the country as well as of himself, required him to lie about what he saw the prospects were. But some people told the truth to Bob Woodward in this book, And here are the two quotes I was coming to. Page 332. Petraeus said privately about the escalation that the president had decided on, which had been recommended by Petraeus, in the USA minority. This is indirect quotes, which usually indicates in Woodward's book that it was said directly to Woodward. But he doesn't identify, has no footnotes, he doesn't identify. But he is asserting that it was said privately to someone, and usually these direct quotes imply that it was said directly to Woodward, about the escalation in Afghanistan. You have to recognize also that I don't think you win this war. This is the war we're sending the 30,000 to indefinitely. I think you keep fighting. It's a little bit like Iraq, actually. Iraq is a bit of a metaphor for this. Yes, there have been enormous progress in Iraq, has been. But there are still horrific attacks in Iraq, and you have to stay with it, vigilant. You have to stay after it. This is the kind of fight we're in for the rest of our lives, and probably our kids' lives. So Petraeus has his feet on the ground too. He thinks it's good for us, but he recognizes this is for our kids' lives, and I believe that on our current course. This is not to say that we were likely to start reducing in the beginning of the middle of this coming year, as Obama promised us over and over. I thought was always either naive on his part or false. That was not going to happen. The idea that we would, now he's talking about getting all the troops out by the end of 2014. That is not going to happen. Our kids will live a lot longer than that, and so will this war. But the next paragraph on page 333 by the man who just died, the giant who was being eulogized so much, is, I think, comes very close to the statement that he's quoted as being his last words before he went under anesthetic for what came to be a 22-hour operation in which he died. And the last words he said were, "You've got to get us out. You've got to end the war in Afghanistan." So the White House is now busy at work saying that was wry banter on the table. These last words, he was just kidding around. He didn't really mean that. How could he have meant that? After all, we're not ready to negotiate, which he saw as his job, because we haven't actually, we haven't achieved a position of strength, et cetera, et cetera. So he couldn't have meant that. Here is the last quote of this chapter in Obama's war. Perhaps, page 333, perhaps the most pessimistic view came from Richard Holbrooke. It can't work, he said. End of chapter. End of story for Richard. But at least he went out having said some true words. First to Bob Woodward a year ago, and to his relatives as he went on the operating table.